Hi, my name is Zara, and 3 weeks ago my own sister deliberately left my name off the guest list for her engagement party at a $200,000 venue. But when the groom's father pulled me aside that night, what he told me changed everything I thought I knew about family loyalty. The conversation lasted exactly 7 minutes, but it unraveled 26 years of lies my parents had been telling both of us. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I thought betrayal would feel like a knife in the back. Instead, it felt like finally understanding why the puzzle pieces of my childhood never quite fit together. Why certain conversations stopped when I entered rooms. Why photo albums from family vacations seemed to skip entire days. Why my college graduation dinner was just the 4 of us at a chain restaurant, while Celeste's high school drama awards got a private dining room with 30 guests. The invitation never came. I found out about Celeste's engagement party, the way you discover most family secrets in the digital age, through someone else's social media story. There I was, scrolling through Instagram while waiting for my coffee to brew on a Thursday morning, when Aunt Diane's story popped up. A screenshot of the most elegant cream-colored invitation I'd ever seen, embossed lettering announcing the celebration of Celeste Delacroix and Harrison Vale's engagement at the historic Magnolia Plantation Gardens. The date was 2 weeks away. The time was 7 in the evening. The dress code was cocktail attire. At the bottom, in delicate script, it read, "Adults Only Celebration," followed by an RSVP phone number I recognized as my mother's personal line. I stared at that image until my coffee grew cold in my hands, reading every word 3 times, as if I might have missed the part where my name appeared somewhere, anywhere, as a guest, as a family member, as someone who mattered enough to witness my sister's milestone. My phone slipped from my fingers and clattered against the kitchen counter. The sound echoed through my apartment in Charleston's French Quarter, bouncing off the exposed brick walls and hardwood floors I'd spent 2 years saving to afford. This place was my sanctuary, filled with plants that actually thrived under my care, and books arranged by emotion rather than alphabet. The morning light streaming through my tall windows usually felt warm and promising. Today, it felt harsh and interrogating. I called my mother directly. No preamble, no small talk about the weather or my job at the Historic Preservation Society. Victoria Delacroix answered on the 3rd ring with her practiced telephone voice, the one she used for charity boards and social committees. "Zara, darling, how lovely to hear from you this morning." "Mom, I saw Aunt Diane's story about Celeste's engagement party." The pause stretched longer than it should have. In that silence, I could hear the grandfather clock in their Mount Pleasant mansion ticking away seconds, while she calculated her response. "Oh, sweetheart, didn't Celeste mention it to you? It's such an intimate gathering. Really just Harrison's family and a few close friends. You know how these events can get overwhelming when the guest list grows too large." Intimate. 47 people, according to the story Aunt Diane had enthusiastically shared, complete with a professional photographer and a jazz quartet. Intimate like the small baby shower they'd thrown for our cousin's wife last spring, where I'd arrived to find a party planner directing traffic and a dessert table that looked like something from a magazine spread. "I'm her sister, Mom." "Of course you are, darling, and you'll have so many opportunities to celebrate with them. The wedding will be the real celebration, won't it? This is just a little cocktail thing." A little cocktail thing at one of Charleston's most exclusive venues, where the waiting list for events stretched 18 months ahead, and the rental fees started at figures most people spent on cars. I'd researched the Magnolia Plantation Gardens extensively for work, had written grant applications to fund preservation projects there. I knew exactly how much this little cocktail thing was costing. "Mom, I'd really like to be there." Another pause. This one felt different. More calculated, like she was weighing options on an invisible scale. "Well, let me speak with Celeste about it. You know how brides can be about their vision. I'll see what I can do." The conversation ended with promises to call me back and suggestions that we have lunch soon to catch up properly. I knew that callback would never come, just like the lunch invitation would evaporate into the Charleston humidity. This was the same dance we performed my entire adult life. The promise, the delay, the gentle redirection until the moment passed and became old news, no longer worth discussing. I spent the rest of that day trying to focus on work, cataloging architectural details for a restoration project on King Street. But my mind kept drifting to the plantation gardens, imagining my sister in whatever designer dress she'd undoubtedly chosen. Surrounded by Harrison's family and friends I'd never met, toasting a future I apparently wasn't invited to witness. That evening, I called Celeste directly. We hadn't spoken in almost 2 months, not since Easter dinner, when she'd announced her engagement by sliding her hand across the dining table to show off a diamond that caught the chandelier light like a tiny star. I'd been genuinely happy for her then, had hugged her, and asked about wedding plans, and listened to her gush about Harrison's proposal on the beach at Kiowa Island. "Zara!" Her voice was bright and busy, the sound of someone juggling multiple conversations. "I'm so glad you called. I've been meaning to catch up with you. Celeste, I saw the invitation to your engagement party." The background noise on her end quieted suddenly, like she'd moved to a different room. "Oh, yeah, Mom said she was going to talk to you about that." "She did. She said it was intimate." "It is. I mean, it's really just Harrison's side of the family. And a few people from work. You know how his parents are about these formal things. They have very specific ideas about guest lists and social dynamics." This was new information. In all the months since Celeste had started dating Harrison, I'd heard almost nothing about his parents, except that his father owned several successful restaurants throughout the Lowcountry, and his mother served on various cultural committees. They sounded like exactly the kind of people who would understand the importance of including immediate family members in milestone celebrations. "I'm your sister Celeste. I know that, of course I know that, it's just complicated right now. Harrison's family is very traditional about these things, and they have strong opinions about how events should be structured. I don't want to create any tension." The words sat between us like a challenge. I could push harder, could demand to know what she meant by traditional and structured and tension. I could point out that I never even met Harrison's parents, so how could they possibly have opinions about my presence at family events? I could remind her of all the times I'd stood beside her at important moments, from high school graduations to college presentations to job interviews where she'd needed moral support. Instead, I asked the question that had been building in my chest all day. What did Mom and Dad tell them about me? The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "Celeste?" "They didn't tell them anything bad, if that's what you're asking. They just explained that you're very independent and prefer smaller gatherings, that you get overwhelmed at big social events." My coffee mug, still sitting on the counter from that morning, suddenly felt heavier in my hand. I'd never expressed a preference for smaller gatherings. If anything, I'd always been the one trying to organize family dinners and holiday traditions, sending group texts about birthday celebrations, and suggesting we all meet for brunch after particularly stressful weeks. I'd spent years trying to create the kind of closeness I saw in other families, the easy intimacy that seemed to come naturally to everyone else. I never said that. Well, maybe not directly, but you know how you are at family events? You always seem a little out of place, like you'd rather be somewhere else. The accusation landed like a physical blow. I thought about every family gathering I'd attended, every effort I'd made to engage with relatives and family friends, every conversation I'd initiated and smile I'd maintained, even when I felt overlooked or dismissed. If I seemed out of place, maybe it was because I was consistently treated like an outsider, seated at tables where conversations flowed around me, rather than including me. I would have liked the chance to decide that for myself. "Zara, please don't make this harder than it needs to be. This whole engagement has been stressful enough without family drama. Can't you just be happy for me?" The conversation ended the way they always did, with me backing down and her feeling justified in her choices. I told her I was happy for her, that I hoped the party was beautiful, that I looked forward to meeting Harrison's family at some future occasion that we both knew would never be quite the right time. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen as twilight painted the walls purple and gold. Outside, tourists wandered the cobblestone streets of the French Quarter, taking photos of the historic architecture and Spanish moss draped like lace over ancient oak trees. Charleston was built on stories, layers of history stacked on top of each other, until the weight of the past shaped the present in ways both visible and hidden. I poured myself a glass of wine and opened my laptop. If I couldn't attend the party, maybe I could at least understand what I was missing. The Magnolia Plantations website showed breathtaking photos of garden terraces cascading toward the Ashley River, historic buildings restored to antebellum elegance, and event spaces that looked like something from a fairy tale. The pricing information was available only by request, but even the basic rental fees started higher than my annual salary. This wasn't a spontaneous celebration or a casual gathering among friends. This was a carefully orchestrated social event, the kind of party that announced not just an engagement, but a merging of two established Charleston families. The kind of event where guest lists were strategic documents and seating arrangements carried social significance. I was scrolling through photos of previous weddings held at the plantation when my phone buzzed with a text from Nora, my closest friend since college. She worked as a freelance event photographer and had an uncanny ability to sense when I was spiraling into family-related anxiety. Wine emergency or ice cream emergency? I'm bringing supplies either way. 20 minutes later, she was at my door with a bottle of Prosecco and a pint of salted caramel ice cream, her camera bag still slung over her shoulder from whatever event she'd been documenting earlier that day.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Nora had wild curly hair that defied humidity, and a laugh that could fill entire rooms. She also had the particular brand of loyalty that made her willing to show up with comfort food and listening ears whenever the Delacroix family dynamics became too much to navigate alone. "Spill," she said, settling onto my couch and opening the ice cream without ceremony. I told her about the invitation I never received, the conversation with my mother, the phone call with Celeste. I showed her Aunt Diane's Instagram story and watched her face cycle through expressions of disbelief, anger, and protective indignation. "They excluded you from your own sister's engagement party? According to them, it's intimate, and I don't like big social events anyway. That's complete bullshit, and you know it." Nora had attended enough family functions with me over the years to witness the dynamics firsthand. She'd seen how conversations shifted when I joined them, how plans were made without consulting me, how achievements were celebrated with varying degrees of enthusiasm depending on who was being honored. She'd also seen how hard I tried to bridge those gaps, how much emotional energy I invested in maintaining relationships that often felt one-sided. What if they're right, though? What if I really am as socially awkward as they think I am? "Zara, you organize historical walking tours for tourists. You give presentations to city council members about preservation projects. You can talk to anyone about anything. The problem isn't your social skills. The problem is how your family treats you." We finished the ice cream and most of the Prosecco while analyzing every interaction I'd had with my family over the past 6 months. Nora had a talent for asking questions that cut through my tendency to make excuses for their behavior, forcing me to examine patterns I'd been ignoring for years. "When was the last time they invited you to something without you having to ask about it first?" I couldn't remember. "When was the last time they called you just to check in, not because they needed something?" I couldn't remember that either. "When was the last time they celebrated something you accomplished with the same energy they put into Celeste's achievements?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a candle that had just been extinguished. I thought about my promotion last year, the recognition I'd received for my work on a historic district preservation project, the article about me in the Charleston City paper. My parents had acknowledged these accomplishments with polite congratulations and dinner at a restaurant I'd suggested, not because they'd planned a celebration, but because I'd asked if we could mark the occasion somehow. Meanwhile, Celeste's engagement had been announced with champagne and phone calls to extended family. Her new job as a marketing coordinator had been celebrated with a dinner party at the country club. Her apartment lease renewal had somehow warranted a family brunch to toast her, quote, "stability and good decision-making." "They make me feel invisible," I said finally. "Because they treat you like you are." That night, after Nora left with promises to check in the next day, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan, slowly rotating overhead. My apartment felt smaller than usual, the walls pressing closer in the darkness. I thought about all the family celebrations I'd attended over the years, all the times I'd smiled and laughed and pretended not to notice when conversations excluded me or achievements were minimized. I'd convinced myself that maintaining peace was worth more than demanding recognition, that being included at all was better than risking conflict that might lead to complete exclusion. But maybe I'd already been excluded. Maybe I'd just been too afraid to admit it. The engagement party was scheduled for Saturday evening. I spent the intervening days in a strange liminal space, going through the motions of work and daily life while feeling like I was watching everything from a distance. I updated social media posts for the Preservation Society, attended meetings about upcoming projects, responded to emails with professional efficiency. But underneath the surface, I was consumed by questions I'd never allowed myself to ask before. Why had my parents presented me to Harrison's family as someone who preferred smaller gatherings? What conversations had happened about me without my knowledge? How long had they been shaping narratives about my personality and preferences to justify my exclusion from family events? Friday afternoon, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called the Magnolia Plantation directly and asked if they had any last-minute availability for tours. The receptionist was apologetic, but explained that they were fully booked for the weekend due to a private event on Saturday evening. However, she mentioned that their gardens remained open until sunset for visitors who wanted to walk the grounds independently. I wasn't planning to crash my sister's engagement party. I just wanted to see the space where my family would gather to celebrate a milestone I'd been deemed unworthy to witness. I wanted to understand what I was missing, to put my exclusion in the context of the physical space where it was happening. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of golden light that made Charleston look like a painting. I drove out to the plantation wearing jeans and a simple blouse, nothing that could be mistaken for cocktail attire. The parking lot was already filled with luxury cars, BMWs, Mercedes, a few Teslas, and what looked like a vintage Bentley that probably belonged to someone's grandfather. My Honda Civic felt conspicuous in its ordinariness. I walked the garden slowly, following paths that wound through ancient oak trees draped with Spanish moss. The plantation's main house glowed white in the distance, its columns and wraparound porches restored to antebellum grandeur. Closer to the river, I could see the event space where cocktail tables had been arranged on a terrace overlooking the water. String lights were already twinkling overhead, and servers in black uniforms were making final preparations. The scene was breathtakingly beautiful. Azaleas bloomed in shades of pink and white, their petals scattered across manicured pathways like confetti. The scent of jasmine and magnolia blossoms mixed with the salt air from the Ashley River, creating an atmosphere that felt magical and timeless. This was exactly the kind of setting where memories were made, where families came together to mark important transitions and celebrate new beginnings. I found a bench partially hidden behind a massive camellia bush and sat down to watch as guests began arriving. From this distance, I could see figures in cocktail dresses and sport coats making their way from the parking lot to the terrace, but I couldn't make out faces or identify individuals. It was like watching a movie with the sound turned down, beautiful and compelling but completely separate from my own experience. That's when I heard footsteps on the gravel path behind me. "Excuse me, are you Zara?" I turned to find a tall man in his 60s approaching the bench, his silver hair perfectly styled and his navy blazer tailored to fit his still athletic frame. He had the kind of confident bearing that suggested success and influence, but his expression was curious, rather than confrontational. "Yes," I said, suddenly aware that I was essentially trespassing on what was now private event space. "I'm William Vale, Harrison's father. I was hoping I might have a word with you." My heart hammered against my ribs as I stood up from the bench, brushing imaginary dust from my jeans. William Vale extended his hand with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to putting others at ease, but his eyes held a sharpness that suggested this wasn't a casual encounter. "Mr. Vale, I should explain what I'm doing here. I wasn't trying to intrude on the party, I just wanted to see the gardens. Please, call me William. And you're not intruding at all. In fact, I was rather hoping to run into you this evening." He gestured toward the bench I'd just vacated. "Would you mind if we sat for a moment? There are some things I'd like to discuss with you." The way he said it made my stomach clench. This felt like the beginning of a conversation I wasn't prepared for, delivered by a man whose calm demeanor somehow made everything seem more ominous, rather than less. "I'm not sure what my parents told you about me, but I promise I wasn't planning to crash the party or cause any drama." William's expression shifted slightly. a micro-expression that looked almost like pity crossing his features before settling back into polite neutrality. Your parents have told me quite a lot about you, actually. That's precisely what I wanted to discuss. He settled onto the bench and patted the space beside him. Please. This won't take long, but I think you deserve to hear what's been said. I sat down reluctantly, leaving space between us while trying to read his tone. The party sounds drifted over from the terrace. Laughter and clinking glasses and the soft jazz quartet that Celeste had probably spent weeks selecting. It felt surreal to be having what was clearly going to be an important conversation while my sister's celebration continued just out of sight. Zara, how would you describe your relationship with your family? The question caught me off guard. I'd expected him to ask me to leave, or perhaps to explain why I hadn't been invited to the party. I hadn't expected therapy-style inquiries, delivered in the gentle cadence of someone who already knew the answer. I love them, I said automatically, the response I'd been giving to similar questions my entire life. That wasn't quite what I asked. I looked at him more carefully, taking in the way he held himself with quiet authority, the expensive watch that caught the last rays of sunlight, the wedding ring that spoke of a long marriage. This was a man who had spent decades reading people, making decisions based on character assessments and gut instincts. It's complicated, I said finally. Most family relationships are, but some are complicated in ways that damage the people involved, and others are complicated in ways that strengthen bonds despite difficulties. Which category would you place your family in? The question hung in the air like morning mist over the Ashley River. Beautiful and insubstantial, but somehow changing the entire landscape of our conversation. I found myself really thinking about it, instead of deflecting with the usual platitudes about family loyalty and unconditional love. I don't know, I admitted. I've never thought about it that way before. Your mother called me 3 weeks ago, William said, his voice taking on the matter-of-fact tone of someone delivering important information. She wanted to discuss the guest list for tonight's party. Specifically, she wanted to explain why you wouldn't be attending. My mouth went dry. I'd known, on some level, that conversations had taken place without my knowledge, but hearing it confirmed felt like stepping onto what I'd thought was solid ground, only to discover it was quicksand. What did she tell you? She said you had difficulty in social situations, that you often became overwhelmed at family gatherings and preferred to avoid events where you didn't know many people. She mentioned that you'd specifically requested not to be included in wedding-related festivities because you found them triggering due to your own romantic disappointments. Each word felt like a small slap. Not painful enough to leave marks, but sharp enough to sting and accumulate into something much more damaging. I never said any of that. I didn't think you had. The simple statement hit me harder than if he'd expressed outrage or sympathy. His calm certainty suggested that he'd seen through the narrative my parents had constructed, which meant others might be able to see through it too. Which meant I wasn't crazy for feeling like the version of me that existed in family conversations bore no resemblance to who I actually was. How did you know? William shifted on the bench, angling his body toward me with the focused attention of someone settling in for a longer conversation than either of us had initially planned. Because Harrison talks about you all the time. That statement knocked me completely off balance. I'd met Harrison exactly twice, both times briefly at family dinners where we'd exchanged pleasantries about the weather and my work in historic preservation. He'd seemed polite but distracted, the way people are when they're being introduced to peripheral family members they'll probably never see again. He does? Constantly. He mentions the walking tours you organize, the articles you've written about Charleston's architecture, the preservation projects you've managed. He talks about the time you spent an entire evening explaining the history of the French Quarter to him, about how passionate you become when you discuss the importance of maintaining historical authenticity in restoration work. I remembered that conversation, though I'd assumed Harrison was just being polite when he asked follow-up questions about my job. It had been at Easter dinner, after the initial excitement about the engagement had died down, and the conversation had fractured into smaller groups. Harrison had asked about a historic building renovation project that had been in the local news, and I'd found myself talking more animatedly than usual because someone was actually listening to my responses. He also mentioned that you are the only person in your family who remembered his birthday last month. I had remembered, though I'd second-guessed myself about whether it was appropriate to acknowledge it. I'd sent a simple text message wishing him well, nothing elaborate or presumptuous. Celeste had been traveling for work and had forgotten entirely, which she'd laughed about later as one of those cute girlfriend mistakes that showed how spontaneous and carefree she was. So when your mother called to explain why you wouldn't be attending tonight, and her explanation contradicted everything Harrison had told me about you, I became curious. Curious about what? About why a family would work so hard to exclude someone who, from all external evidence, seemed like exactly the kind of person you'd want at your important celebrations. The jazz music from the terrace swelled slightly, a saxophone melody that sounded melancholy even at a celebration. I watched a great blue heron pick its way carefully along the riverbank, pausing between steps as if each movement required careful consideration. I started paying closer attention at family dinners, William continued, watching how conversations flowed, who was asked for opinions, whose achievements were celebrated and how. I've been in business long enough to recognize certain patterns in group dynamics. What kind of patterns? The kind where one person is systematically marginalized while being made to feel like it's their own fault for not fitting in better. The words settled into my chest like stones dropping to the bottom of a clear pond. They created ripples that touched memories I'd been trying not to examine too closely. Birthday dinners where the conversation focused entirely on other people's accomplishments. Holiday gatherings where I'd arrived to find that plans had been made and changed without anyone thinking to update me. Family photos where I was consistently positioned at the edges, as if whoever was taking the picture wasn't quite sure I belonged in the frame. I thought maybe I was being too sensitive. People who are actually too sensitive don't usually worry about being too sensitive. They're too busy being overwhelmed by their sensitivity to analyze it objectively. William reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, scrolling to something he'd apparently prepared to show me. Your mother sent me these. He handed me the phone, and I found myself looking at a photo album titled Delacroix Family Memories. The cover photo was a beautiful shot of my parents, Celeste, and various relatives gathered around a Christmas tree. It took me a moment to realize what felt off about it. I wasn't in the picture. I scrolled through the album slowly, my stomach sinking with each swipe. Family vacation photos where I'd been cropped out of group shots. Birthday celebrations where the camera had somehow missed capturing me at the table. Holiday gatherings where I'd been present but invisible in the visual record of the event. She sent this to help Harrison's mother understand your family dynamics, William said quietly. To show her what family gatherings looked like when you weren't there to make things uncomfortable with your social difficulties. But I was there, I whispered, staring at a photo from last Thanksgiving where I could see my own shadow at the edge of the frame, evidence that I'd been standing just outside the shot. I was there for all of these. I know you were, Harrison confirmed it. I handed the phone back with trembling fingers. Seeing the deliberate erasure of my presence from family memories felt more violating than any harsh word or direct confrontation would have. This was gaslighting with a professional photographer's precision, a systematic rewriting of history that made me question my own recollections. Why are you telling me this? William pocketed his phone and was quiet for a long moment, watching the heron continue its patient hunt along the water's edge. Because I have a daughter. The simple statement carried weight that I felt rather than understood immediately. She's older than you, married now with children of her own. But there was a period in her 20s when my ex-wife did something similar to what your parents are doing to you. She convinced everyone in our social circle that our daughter was troubled, unreliable, too dramatic for important family events. She had a way of making our daughter's absence seem like a gift to everyone else. What happened? I didn't recognize what was happening until it was almost too late. I was traveling frequently for business, focused on building the restaurants, trusting that my ex-wife was managing family relationships appropriately. By the time I understood what had been going on, my daughter had essentially disappeared from family gatherings entirely. She'd been convinced that her presence was disruptive, that she was doing everyone a favor by staying away. Did you fix it? It took years. and it required me to make some very difficult choices about which relationships I was willing to sacrifice in order to have an honest relationship with my daughter. The implication hung between us like Spanish moss draped between oak branches, beautiful and slightly ominous. I understood that he was telling me this story for a reason, that it connected to my situation in ways I was still processing. Harrison doesn't know any of this yet, William continued. He thinks tonight's party is small because Celeste preferred intimate gatherings. He doesn't know that you were deliberately excluded, or that your parents have been crafting a narrative about you that justifies that exclusion. Are you going to tell him? That depends on you. From the terrace came the sound of someone tapping a fork against a glass, the universal signal for an announcement or toast. I could hear Celeste's laughter carrying across the gardens, bright and celebratory, and completely unaware that her sister was sitting 50 yards away, learning that their parents had been systematically erasing her from family history. What do you mean? I mean that you have choices to make, Zara. You can continue accepting the version of reality your parents have constructed, where you're the difficult one who doesn't fit in, where your absence from important events is actually a kindness to everyone else. Or you can decide that you deserve better than that. I don't want to cause problems for Celeste. The problems already exist. The question is whether you're going to keep absorbing them silently, or whether you're going to insist on being treated with basic respect. A server in a black uniform appeared on the path, probably looking for guests who had wandered away from the party. William waved him off with a polite gesture that somehow conveyed both authority and dismissal. There's something else you should know, he said once the server had retreated. Your parents didn't just exclude you from tonight's party, they've also suggested that you shouldn't be included in the wedding party. The statement hit me like a physical blow. I'd been wondering about bridesmaid plans, waiting for Celeste to bring up dress shopping or bachelorette party arrangements. I'd assumed she was just busy with other wedding planning details, and would get around to including me eventually. They told Harrison's mother that you'd specifically requested not to be a bridesmaid because you felt uncomfortable being the center of attention during wedding ceremonies. That's not true. I know it's not true. The question is, what are you going to do about it? The heron finally struck, its long beak disappearing into the water and emerging with a silver fish that flashed once in the dying light before disappearing down the bird's throat. The hunting was patient, precise, successful. It had waited for exactly the right moment and then acted with complete commitment. I don't know what I can do about it. They'll just say I'm being dramatic or causing unnecessary conflict. They'll say that regardless of how you handle this situation, Zara. The question is whether you want to be having this same conversation with someone else in 10 years. Wondering why your own family systematically excludes you from important moments while making you feel like it's your fault. From the party came the sound of applause and more laughter. Someone was giving a toast, probably celebrating the love between Harrison and Celeste, the bright future ahead of them, the joy of two families coming together. It was exactly the kind of moment I'd spent my life believing I wanted to be part of, the warmth and connection I'd been trying to earn through perfect behavior and selfless accommodation. What did you do about your daughter? I told my ex-wife that she could choose to include our daughter respectfully in family events, or she could plan those events without my presence or financial support. I made it clear that marginalizing my daughter was the same as marginalizing me. And that worked? Eventually. After some very unpleasant conversations and a few holidays spent apart while everyone adjusted to the new expectations. William stood up from the bench and brushed off his jacket with the careful attention of someone preparing to return to a social situation that required performance. I'm going back to the party now, Zara. But I want you to know that Harrison is planning to call you tomorrow. He wants to ask you personally to be part of the wedding, regardless of what your parents have suggested. My heart started racing again, but this time it felt different. Not the panicked hammering of someone caught trespassing, but the rapid beat of someone standing at the edge of a cliff who had just been offered a parachute. What should I tell him? Tell him the truth. Tell him what you want, not what you think everyone else wants to hear. William started walking back toward the party, then paused and turned around. One more thing, Zara. Your parents didn't just exclude you from tonight's guest list. They also told Harrison's mother that you probably wouldn't attend the wedding either, because you'd indicated that watching Celeste get married would be too painful given your own romantic situation. The final revelation felt like the last piece of a puzzle clicking into place, completing a picture I'd been trying not to see clearly. My parents hadn't just marginalized me from this one event. They were proactively writing me out of future celebrations, creating a narrative that would justify my absence from my own sister's wedding. I've never said anything like that to them. I know you haven't. The question is, are you going to let them keep speaking for you? William Vale walked back toward the lights and laughter of his son's engagement party, leaving me alone on a bench in the gathering darkness with the most important decision I'd ever had to make. The heron had moved further down the riverbank, still hunting with infinite patience. In the distance, I could hear my sister's voice rising above the crowd, probably thanking everyone for sharing this special evening with her and Harrison. I sat there until the stars began appearing overhead, thinking about constructed narratives and chosen silence, about the difference between keeping peace and keeping dignity. The party continued without me, just as my parents had planned, but for the first time in my adult life, I understood that my absence was not a natural consequence of who I was, but a deliberate choice made by people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. When I finally walked back to my car, my phone was buzzing with a text from Nora. "How are you holding up tonight? Want me to come over with more ice cream?" I typed back quickly before starting the engine. "Actually, I think I need to make some phone calls instead, but save the ice cream for tomorrow. I have a feeling I'm going to need it after I figure out what I'm going to say to Harrison." The drive back to my apartment felt different than the drive out to the plantation. The same roads, the same landmarks, but I was returning as someone who finally understood the game that had been played around me for years. Understanding the rules didn't automatically make winning easier, but it at least made losing a conscious choice rather than an inevitable outcome. I had until tomorrow to decide who I wanted to be in this story. The difficult sister who graciously accepted exclusion, or the woman who demanded to be treated with respect, even if it made everyone else uncomfortable. For the first time in my life, I knew which choice I was going to make. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, writing down every family event from the past 5 years where I'd felt confused by my reception, every conversation that had ended with me apologizing for things I couldn't quite identify, every time I'd left a gathering wondering what I'd done wrong. The list filled 3 pages by dawn. The pattern was undeniable when laid out in black ink. Christmas morning, where I'd arrived to find that gift opening had already started because we thought you weren't coming since you didn't confirm. My college graduation party that had been scheduled for the same weekend as Celeste's sorority formal, with apologies about the unfortunate timing that couldn't be helped. The family cruise last summer where my cabin reservation had somehow been mixed up, and there wasn't space for me after all, but wasn't I lucky to have such a flexible work schedule that missing it wouldn't be a problem? Each incident had seemed reasonable in isolation, accompanied by logical explanations and expressions of regret about circumstances beyond anyone's control. Viewed together, they formed a clear picture of systematic exclusion disguised as unfortunate coincidences. My phone rang at 8:30. Harrison's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. I wasn't ready for the conversation I knew we needed to have, wasn't sure I could articulate what I'd learned without sounding paranoid or vindictive. But William's words echoed in my mind about choosing truth over comfortable silence. "Hi Harrison. Zara, I hope I'm not calling too early. I wanted to catch you before you started your day." His voice sounded different than it had during our brief interactions at family dinners. Less polite, more genuine, like he was talking to someone he actually wanted to connect with rather than going through social motions. "It's fine. I've been up for a while. Listen, I know you weren't at the engagement party last night, and I wanted to talk to you about that. There seems to be some confusion about your involvement in our wedding plans." I took a deep breath, feeling like I was standing at the edge of a diving board looking down at water that might be deeper than it appeared. "What kind of confusion?" "Well, your parents mentioned that you'd expressed some reservations about being part of the wedding party, but that doesn't match up with what I know about you. And honestly, it doesn't match up with what Celeste told me when we first got engaged." My heart started beating faster. "What did Celeste tell you originally?" "She said you'd probably be her maid of honor. that you two had talked about being in each other's weddings since you were kids. She seemed excited about having you help with planning, and all the traditional sister stuff. I closed my eyes, remembering conversations from our childhood, where we'd planned elaborate fantasy weddings with each other as the most important attendants. Celeste was right, we had talked about it, had made those promises that little girls make about being there for each other's biggest moments. What changed her mind? That's what I'm trying to figure out. Over the past few weeks, the story shifted to you being uncomfortable with the attention that comes with being in a wedding party, preferring to participate as a guest instead. But my dad mentioned that he had a conversation with you last night that suggested otherwise. I could practically feel the ground shifting beneath my feet. William had kept his word about giving me the choice to tell Harrison the truth myself, but he'd clearly indicated that a conversation needed to happen. Harrison, can I ask you something honestly? Of course. What do you actually know about me? Not what my parents have told you, but what you've observed yourself. There was a pause while he considered the question. I know you're passionate about your work in ways that make your whole face light up when you talk about it. I know you remember details about people that most family members don't bother tracking. I know you ask thoughtful questions and actually listen to the answers. And I know that you seem to care deeply about Celeste's happiness, even when the family dynamic gets complicated. Each observation felt like a small validation, evidence that who I actually was had been visible to him even when it seemed invisible to everyone else. What else do you know? I know that you've been edited out of most of the family photos your mother shows people, and I know that doesn't happen by accident. The statement hung between us like a bridge I could choose to cross or ignore. Harrison had noticed the deliberate erasure without anyone pointing it out to him, which meant it had been obvious enough for an outsider to recognize, even when I'd been too close to the situation to see it clearly. Your father told you about our conversation. He told me that he'd learned some things about how your family operates that concerned him. He suggested I might want to hear your perspective directly rather than relying on secondhand information. I stood up from the kitchen table and walked to my living room window, looking out at the morning light filtering through the oak trees that lined my street. A jogger passed by with her dog, both of them moving with the easy rhythm of a daily routine. Normal life continuing while I prepared to have a conversation that might change everything. Harrison, what I'm about to tell you might make things complicated between you and my parents. They're already complicated, Zara. The question is whether we're going to acknowledge that and deal with it honestly, or keep pretending everything is fine while people get hurt. I told him everything. The engagement party invitation I'd never received, the phone calls, where I'd been told I wasn't welcome, the conversation with William about the narratives that had been constructed about my social difficulties and romantic disappointments. I told him about the photo albums and the systematic exclusion, and the years of feeling like I was failing at being the kind of family member everyone wanted me to be. Harrison listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of acknowledgement that encouraged me to continue. When I finished, there was a long silence that felt different from the calculated pauses I was used to from family conversations. This felt like someone processing information rather than formulating a response designed to manage my emotions. Jesus Christ, Zara, I'm so sorry. You don't need to apologize. You didn't know. I should have known. I should have asked more questions when the story about your involvement kept changing. I should have insisted you be included in last night's party regardless of what anyone else thought was appropriate. It's not your responsibility to manage my family relationships. Actually, it is. If I'm marrying into this family, if I'm going to be your brother-in-law, then it absolutely is my responsibility to make sure you're treated with respect. And if I'm going to have children someday who call you Aunt Zara, then I have a duty to make sure they grow up seeing healthy family dynamics. Not whatever this is. Hi, my name is Zara, and 3 weeks ago my own sister deliberately left my name off the guest list for her engagement party at a $200,000 venue. But when the groom's father pulled me aside that night, what he told me changed everything I thought I knew about family loyalty. The conversation lasted exactly 7 minutes, but it unraveled 26 years of lies my parents had been telling both of us. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I thought betrayal would feel like a knife in the back. Instead, it felt like finally understanding why the puzzle pieces of my childhood never quite fit together. Why certain conversations stopped when I entered rooms. Why photo albums from family vacations seemed to skip entire days. Why my college graduation dinner was just the four of us at a chain restaurant, while Celeste's high school drama awards got a private dining room with 30 guests. The invitation never came. I found out about Celeste's engagement party, the way you discover most family secrets in the digital age, through someone else's social media story. There I was, scrolling through Instagram while waiting for my coffee to brew on a Thursday morning, when Aunt Diane's story popped up. A screenshot of the most elegant cream-colored invitation I'd ever seen, embossed lettering announcing the celebration of Celeste Delacroix and Harrison Vale's engagement at the historic Magnolia Plantation Gardens. The date was 2 weeks away. The time was 7 in the evening. The dress code was cocktail attire. At the bottom, in delicate script, it read, "Adults Only Celebration," followed by an RSVP phone number I recognized as my mother's personal line. I stared at that image until my coffee grew cold in my hands, reading every word 3 times, as if I might have missed the part where my name appeared somewhere, anywhere, as a guest, as a family member, as someone who mattered enough to witness my sister's milestone. My phone slipped from my fingers and clattered against the kitchen counter. The sound echoed through my apartment in Charleston's French Quarter, bouncing off the exposed brick walls and hardwood floors I'd spent 2 years saving to afford. This place was my sanctuary, filled with plants that actually thrived under my care, and books arranged by emotion rather than alphabet. The morning light streaming through my tall windows usually felt warm and promising. Today, it felt harsh and interrogating. I called my mother directly. No preamble, no small talk about the weather or my job at the Historic Preservation Society. Victoria Delacroix answered on the 3rd ring with her practiced telephone voice, the one she used for charity boards and social committees. "Zara, darling, how lovely to hear from you this morning." "Mom, I saw Aunt Diane's story about Celeste's engagement party." The pause stretched longer than it should have. In that silence, I could hear the grandfather clock in their Mount Pleasant mansion ticking away seconds, while she calculated her response. "Oh, sweetheart, didn't Celeste mention it to you? It's such an intimate gathering. Really just Harrison's family and a few close friends. You know how these events can get overwhelming when the guest list grows too large." Intimate. 47 people, according to the story Aunt Diane had enthusiastically shared, complete with a professional photographer and a jazz quartet. Intimate like the small baby shower they'd thrown for our cousin's wife last spring, where I'd arrived to find a party planner directing traffic and a dessert table that looked like something from a magazine spread. "I'm her sister, Mom." "Of course you are, darling, and you'll have so many opportunities to celebrate with them. The wedding will be the real celebration, won't it? This is just a little cocktail thing." A little cocktail thing at one of Charleston's most exclusive venues, where the waiting list for events stretched 18 months ahead, and the rental fee started at figures most people spent on cars. I'd researched the Magnolia Plantation Gardens extensively for work, had written grant applications to fund preservation projects there. I knew exactly how much this little cocktail thing was costing. "Mom, I'd really like to be there." Another pause. This one felt different, more calculated, like she was weighing options on an invisible scale. "Well, let me speak with Celeste about it. You know how brides can be about their vision. I'll see what I can do." The conversation ended with promises to call me back and suggestions that we have lunch soon to catch up properly. Like we're dysfunctional. Like we can't manage basic relationships without creating drama. Like there's something wrong with us that Harrison's family needs to worry about. Maybe there is something wrong with us. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. "Celeste? I can't believe you're doing this. I can't believe you're trying to sabotage my relationship because you're jealous that I'm getting married and you're not." The accusation hit like a physical slap, not because it was true, but because it was so far from the truth that it revealed how little my sister actually understood about my motivations or feelings. "Is that really what you think this is about? What else could it be about? You've never been happy for me when good things happen. You always find ways to make my celebrations about your problems instead." I looked across the apartment to where Nora was pretending to examine the books on my shelf while clearly listening to every word of the conversation. "Celeste, I want you to think about something. In the past 5 years, can you remember a single time when I made your celebrations about me? A single instance where I caused drama or demanded attention during your important moments? You're doing it right now. I'm having a private conversation with your fiancé about why I was excluded from your engagement party. The only reason this is affecting your celebration is because the exclusion happened in the first place. Mom explained that to you. It was supposed to be intimate. Did you know that Mom sent Harrison's mother a photo album of family events with me cropped out of the pictures? Another long pause. What are you talking about? Did you know that she told them I specifically requested not to be a bridesmaid because I find weddings emotionally triggering? That's ridiculous. You never said that. Did you know that she told them I probably wouldn't attend your wedding at all because watching you get married would be too painful for me given my romantic situation? The silence this time felt different, less defensive and more uncertain. Celeste, I need you to really think about this. Have I ever given you any indication that I didn't want to be part of your wedding? Have I ever said or done anything that suggested I couldn't handle being around happy couples or that your relationship made me uncomfortable? No, she said quietly. You've been excited about the wedding since we got engaged. So why do you think Mom would tell Harrison's family something different? I could hear Celeste breathing on the other end of the line, could almost feel her processing information that didn't fit the narrative she'd been accepting without question. Maybe she misunderstood something you said. Maybe. Or maybe she's been managing both of our relationships with each other by controlling the information we each receive. Why would she do that? It was the right question, finally, the one that opened space for honest examination instead of defensive reactions. I don't know, Celeste, but I think we need to figure it out. Harrison is furious. He wants to uninvite Mom and Dad from the wedding. What do you want? I want my family to act like a normal family for once. I want to get married without having to worry about who's going to be offended by what or which conversations are going to turn into arguments about things that happened years ago. Then maybe we need to have those arguments now, before your wedding, so they don't poison your actual celebration. Celeste was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice sounded younger, more uncertain than I'd heard it since we were children. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to have those conversations without everything falling apart. We don't have to do it alone. Harrison wants to help, and honestly, his father seems to have some experience dealing with family dynamics like ours. You like Harrison's family. It wasn't a question, more like a realization she was speaking out loud. I like Harrison. I want you to be happy with him. I want to be part of your marriage in whatever way feels natural and healthy for all of us. Even after everything that's happened? Celeste, you're my sister. That doesn't change, because our parents have been managing our relationship poorly. But I'm not going to keep pretending that poor management is normal or acceptable. After we hung up, Nora returned to the living room with fresh coffee and the expression of someone who had been mentally composing supportive speeches throughout my entire phone call. How do you feel? Terrified, I said honestly. Like I just set something in motion that I can't control. Good. You've been trying to control the uncontrollable for years. Maybe it's time to see what happens when you let reality be reality, instead of managing everyone else's version of it. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. When I opened it, I found a message from William Vale. Harrison told me about your conversation. Patricia and I would like to invite you to lunch this week if you're available. We think it's time we got to know our future daughter-in-law's sister properly. I showed the text to Nora, who grinned like someone who had just watched the good guys win a particularly satisfying victory. Looks like you've got allies. It feels weird to have people take my side without me having to convince them that I deserve it. Get used to it. This is what healthy relationships look like. That afternoon, I did something I'd never done before. I called my parents and asked them to come over for a conversation. Not dinner, not a casual visit, but a specific discussion about family dynamics that needed to happen in neutral territory, where I felt confident and they couldn't control the environment. Of course, sweetheart, my mother said, though I could hear the confusion in her voice. Is everything all right? We'll discuss it when you get here. They arrived 2 hours later, both of them dressed as if they were going to brunch at the country club, rather than having a difficult conversation in their daughter's modest apartment. My father carried flowers, which he presented with the kind of theatrical gesture that was designed to set a tone of celebration rather than confrontation. "What a lovely surprise to see your place again," my mother said, settling onto my couch and arranging her skirt with practiced elegance. "It's been too long since we've had time to just visit." I remained standing, a choice that felt both natural and strategic. I wasn't their little girl in her own space, grateful for their attention and eager to accommodate their preferences. I was an adult woman in her own home, about to have an adult conversation about unacceptable behavior. I talked to Harrison this morning. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. My father's smile became more fixed, and my mother's hands stilled in their automatic fidgeting with her jewelry. "Did you?" my mother said. "How nice. I hope you had a chance to congratulate him on the lovely engagement party." "It was such a beautiful evening. Actually, we talked about why I wasn't invited to that lovely engagement party." "Oh, sweetheart, we explained that to you. It was meant to be intimate, just immediate family and Harrison's closest relatives." "Mom, I am immediate family. I'm Celeste's sister." "Of course you are. We just thought you'd be more comfortable at a smaller celebration. You know how you get at big social events?" I looked at my father, who was examining my bookshelf with the kind of intense concentration people use to avoid eye contact during uncomfortable conversations. "Dad, when have you ever seen me get uncomfortable at social events?" He turned around slowly, his expression carefully neutral. "Well, you've always been more reserved than Celeste, more selective about your social activities. That's not the same thing as being uncomfortable at family celebrations." "Isn't it?" my mother interjected. "You've skipped quite a few family gatherings over the years." "I've been excluded from quite a few family gatherings over the years. There's a difference." The room went very quiet. Outside, I could hear a neighbor's lawnmower starting up and the distant sound of children playing in the courtyard of my apartment complex. Normal Sunday afternoon sounds that felt incongruous with the tension building in my living room. "Zara," my father said finally, using the patient tone he'd always employed when he thought I was being unreasonable. "I think there might be some misunderstanding here." "I don't think there's any misunderstanding at all. I think there's been very deliberate management of information and very intentional exclusion disguised as consideration for my supposed social anxieties." My mother's composure cracked slightly, a micro-expression of surprise that she quickly smoothed back into concerned confusion. "Sweetheart, that's a very serious accusation." "It is, and I have some very serious questions about why you sent Harrison's mother a photo album with me edited out of family pictures." This time, the silence stretched so long that the lawnmower outside completed an entire pass across the yard before anyone spoke. "How did you know about that?" my mother asked quietly. "Because Harrison's father told me." Because he recognized that systematically erasing someone from family memories isn't normal behavior and wanted to understand what was happening. I watched my parents exchange a look that lasted perhaps 3 seconds but communicated volumes. Not surprise, not confusion about false accusations, but the specific kind of eye contact that passes between people who have been caught doing exactly what they've been accused of doing. "We can explain," my father said. "Please do." My father sat down heavily in the armchair across from my couch, suddenly looking older than his 63 years. My mother remained perfectly upright, but her hands had begun the nervous jewelry fidgeting that I'd learned to recognize as a sign that her carefully maintained composure was starting to fracture. "The photo album wasn't meant to hurt you," she began, her voice taking on the reasonable tone she'd always used when explaining why her choices were actually in everyone's best interest. "We were trying to present our family in the best possible light for Harrison's parents. You know how important first impressions are in these situations. And you thought the best possible light meant erasing me completely? Not erasing you. Just showcasing the family dynamics that work most smoothly." The casual way she said it made my stomach clench. This wasn't a slip of judgment or a momentary lapse in consideration. This was a calculated decision based on a worldview where some family members were assets to be displayed and others were complications to be managed. What does that mean exactly? My mother glanced at my father, who was studying his hands with the intensity of someone reading a fascinating novel. "Marcus, help me explain this." He looked up reluctantly, the expression of a man who had hoped this conversation would never need to happen. Zara, you have to understand that these social connections matter more than you realize. Harrison's family moves in circles where perception carries real weight. Business deals, social standing, future opportunities for Celeste, all of these things can be affected by how our family is perceived. And how exactly do I affect those perceptions? You don't, my mother said quickly. That's not what we mean. It's just that you've always marched to your own drummer, sweetheart. You chose a career in historic preservation instead of something more prestigious. You live in this charming little apartment instead of investing in property that would appreciate more significantly. You're wonderfully authentic, but authenticity doesn't always translate well in certain social situations. I felt something cold settling in my chest, the recognition that this conversation was revealing truths I'd spent years refusing to acknowledge. So you decided that I was a liability. That's not the word we would use, my father interjected. What word would you use? They looked at each other again, engaged in some kind of silent negotiation about how much honesty this moment required. We would say that we were being protective, my mother said finally. Protective of you, protective of Celeste, protective of the family's relationships with people who matter. Protective of me how? By not putting you in situations where you might feel out of place or uncomfortable. By not forcing you to navigate social dynamics that don't come naturally to you. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had been burning unnoticed for years. I could finally see clearly what had been happening. The systematic redefinition of my choices and preferences to justify decisions that had nothing to do with my actual needs or desires. When have I ever told you that I felt out of place at family events? You didn't have to tell us, my mother said with the confidence of someone who had convinced herself that her assumptions were based on observable evidence. We could see it. The way you'd sit quietly during conversations. The way you'd leave early from parties. The way you never seemed quite as excited about family celebrations as everyone else. I sat quietly because no one asked for my opinions. I left early because I felt unwelcome. I seemed less excited because my excitement was never acknowledged or reciprocated. That's not how we remember it. Quote, that's because you weren't paying attention to how I actually felt. You were paying attention to how my feelings affected your plans. My father leaned forward in his chair, assuming the posture he'd always used when he wanted to redirect difficult conversations toward more manageable topics. Zara, I think we're getting lost in details here. The important thing is that we all love each other, and we all want what's best for this family. Do you love me the same way you love Celeste? The question came out more directly than I'd intended, but once it was in the air, I realized it was the most important thing I needed to understand. Of course we do, my mother said. But her response came a fraction of a second too slow and with a fraction too much emphasis, the way people answer when they're trying to convince themselves as much as their audience. Then why don't you treat me the same way you treat Celeste? We treat you according to your different needs and personalities. Celeste's career is celebrated. Mine is tolerated. Celeste's achievements are announced to extended family. Mine are acknowledged privately. Celeste's social preferences are accommodated. Mine are reinterpreted to justify exclusion. I was ticking off the differences on my fingers, and with each point my parents seemed to shrink slightly into themselves. You're being overly dramatic about this, my father said, but without his usual conviction. Am I? When Celeste got promoted last year, you threw her a dinner party and invited 12 people to celebrate. When I got promoted, you took me to lunch and spent most of the meal talking about Celeste's new apartment. Those were different situations. How were they different? Celeste's promotion was to a management position at a well-known firm. Your promotion was within the same small organization you'd been working at for years. So my achievements matter less because my career matters less. That's not what we said. It's exactly what you said. You just said it politely. My mother stood up abruptly and walked to my kitchen, ostensibly to get a glass of water but clearly to create some physical distance from the conversation. I could hear her opening cabinets, the clink of glass, the sound of the faucet running. When she returned, her composure had been carefully reconstructed. Zara, I think you're misinterpreting a lot of things because you're feeling hurt about the engagement party. But you have to understand that these social situations are complicated. There are dynamics at play that you don't fully appreciate. Then explain them to me. Harrison's mother comes from a very established Charleston family. She has certain expectations about how families present themselves, how relationships are structured, what kind of behavior is appropriate in different contexts. What kind of behavior? Traditional behavior. Conservative values. The kind of family stability that comes from clear roles and mutual respect for hierarchy. I felt like I was finally seeing the complete picture, understanding not just what had been done, but why it had been justified in their minds. And you didn't think I could represent those values appropriately? We didn't want to put you in a position where you might say or do something that would reflect poorly on Celeste. Like what? Like expressing your opinions about things you don't fully understand. Like asking questions that might make people uncomfortable. Like drawing attention to yourself, when the focus should be on celebrating Celeste and Harrison. Each accusation felt like a small knife, not because it was true, but because it revealed how little they trusted my judgment, my social skills, my ability to behave appropriately in situations that mattered to them. When have I ever drawn inappropriate attention to myself at family events? It's not about what you've done, my father said. It's about managing risk. I'm a risk to be managed. You're a variable that we felt needed to be handled carefully. The clinical language made everything worse somehow. I wasn't their daughter who deserved love and inclusion. I was a problem to be solved, a complication to be minimized, a variable to be controlled. So you decided to handle me by excluding me. We decided to handle the situation by being thoughtful about how we presented our family to people whose opinions could affect Celeste's future. And my future doesn't matter? Of course it matters. But your future isn't dependent on Harrison's family's approval the way Celeste's is. I sat down on my couch, suddenly feeling exhausted by the circular logic and careful phrasing that managed to make systematic exclusion sound like thoughtful family planning. What about the wedding? What about it? Are you planning to manage me as a variable there too? My parents exchanged another look, this one longer and more fraught with unspoken communication. We think it would be best if you participated as a beloved family member, rather than as part of the wedding party, my mother said carefully, because Harrison's family wouldn't approve of me as a bridesmaid. Because we think there are ways to be supportive that don't require you to be in the spotlight during such an important ceremony. You mean ways to be supportive that don't require me to be visible. Zara, please don't twist our words. I'm not twisting anything. I'm just translating your careful language into what it actually means. My father stood up and walked to my living room window, looking out at the street with the kind of intense focus that suggested he was trying to find something in the view that might help him navigate this conversation. What do you want from us? He asked without turning around. I want you to treat me like I'm actually part of this family. You are part of this family. Then I want you to act like it. I want to be included in family events without having to ask. I want my achievements celebrated with the same enthusiasm you show for Celeste's. I want to be consulted about decisions that affect me instead of having my preferences interpreted and managed by people who haven't bothered to ask what they actually are. And if we can't do that? My mother asked quietly. The question surprised me with its directness. I'd expected more deflection, more attempts to reframe the conversation in terms that made their behavior seem reasonable. But she was asking about consequences, about what would happen if they chose not to change their approach to our relationship. Then I guess we'll find out what kind of relationship we can have when I stop trying to earn your approval. What does that mean? It means I'm not going to keep accepting exclusion disguised as consideration. It means I'm not going to keep apologizing for existing in ways that inconvenience your social planning. It means I'm going to make my own decisions about which family events matter enough to attend, regardless of whether I'm officially invited. Are you threatening us? I'm setting boundaries. My father turned back from the window, his expression carrying the kind of frustration that comes from conversations that don't go according to expected scripts. Zara, you're being unreasonable. We've explained our thinking to you. We've been honest about the complexities of these social situations. What more do you want? I want you to acknowledge that your thinking has been wrong. Wrong how? Wrong in assuming that I can't represent our family appropriately. Wrong in deciding that my presence is a risk to be managed rather than an asset to be celebrated. Wrong in editing me out of family narratives to make them more palatable to people whose opinions shouldn't matter more than your own daughter's dignity. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. Not the pause of people calculating responses, but the stillness of people recognizing that they'd reached a moment where choices had to be made and consequences accepted. "And if we don't acknowledge that?" my mother asked. "Then you'll have to decide whether maintaining your social strategy is more important than having an honest relationship with me. That's not a fair choice. It's the choice you created when you decided to prioritize other people's comfort over my inclusion." My phone buzzed with a text message, and I glanced at it automatically. Harrison's name appeared on the screen with a message that said, "How did the conversation go? Dad and I are both thinking about you." I showed the text to my parents, watching their expressions carefully. "Harrison's family is thinking about me," I said. "People I barely know are more concerned about my well-being than my own parents have been." "That's not fair," my father protested. "Isn't it? When was the last time either of you sent me a text just to check how I was doing? When was the last time you called to ask about my work or my life or anything that mattered to me personally, rather than how it affected family dynamics?" I could see them mentally scrolling through recent interactions, trying to find evidence that contradicted my observation. The fact that it was taking them so long to think of examples was answer enough. "We've been busy," my mother said weakly. "You've been busy managing Celeste's engagement and wedding planning. You've had plenty of time for family concerns that you considered important. The wedding is a big event that requires a lot of coordination." "I'm sure it is. And apparently I'm not important enough to be included in that coordination." My father sat back down, looking like a man who had just realized he was losing an argument he'd expected to win easily. "What do you want us to do, Zara? Do you want us to call Harrison's parents and explain that we made mistakes in how we presented you? Do you want us to insist that Celeste make you maid of honor even though the wedding party has already been planned? Do you want us to pretend that social dynamics don't matter when they clearly do? I want you to want to do those things. I want you to be horrified that you excluded your own daughter from important family events, and angry at yourselves for prioritizing strangers' opinions over my feelings. I want you to be motivated by love for me rather than by social strategy. And if we're not?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, like a final test of how far I was willing to push this conversation toward its logical conclusion. "Then I guess we'll all learn something important about what our relationships are actually based on." My mother gathered her purse and stood up with the kind of controlled movements that suggested she was working hard to maintain her dignity, while leaving a conversation that hadn't gone according to plan. "I think we need to take some time to process this conversation," she said. "There are clearly some fundamental disagreements about family priorities that we're not going to resolve this afternoon. There are fundamental disagreements about whether I matter enough to be treated with basic respect." I corrected. "And you're right that we're not going to resolve that this afternoon. That's something you'll have to decide for yourselves." After they left, I sat in my living room for a long time, feeling like I'd just survived a natural disaster that had rearranged the landscape of my life in ways I was still trying to understand. Everything looked the same, but the ground beneath felt completely different. I called Harrison back. "How bad was it?" he asked without preamble. "Educational," I said. "Very, very educational. Are you okay?" "I think so. I mean, I feel horrible, but I also feel like I finally understand what I've been dealing with all these years." "What did they say?" I gave him the condensed version. The social strategy, the risk management, the assumption that I was a liability to be controlled rather than a family member to be celebrated. "Jesus," he said quietly. "I'm so sorry, Zara. You don't need to apologize for them. Someone needs to. And since they apparently aren't going to do it themselves, I will." "What happens now?" "Now Celeste and I have a serious conversation about what kind of family we want to build together and what kind of relationships we're willing to accept in our lives. Harrison, I don't want to be the reason your engagement becomes complicated. You're not the reason it's complicated. The dysfunction was already there. You're just the person who finally insisted that we acknowledge it instead of pretending everything was fine." That evening, Celeste called me. "Mom and Dad came over," she said without preamble. "They told me about your conversation." I figured they would. They said you were unreasonable and dramatic, and that you basically gave them an ultimatum about changing their entire approach to family relationships. That's an accurate summary, yes. They also said you threatened to skip my wedding if they don't start treating you differently. I didn't threaten anything. I just said I was going to make my own decisions about which family events matter enough to attend. What does that mean? It means I'm not going to keep showing up for people who work actively to exclude me, and then act surprised when I point out the contradiction. Celeste was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice sounded smaller, more uncertain. Zara, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Okay. Do you think I knew what they were doing? Do you think I was part of the plan to exclude you from things? The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on my parents' behavior that I hadn't fully considered Celeste's role in the systematic exclusion, whether she'd been an active participant or just someone who benefited from it without examining the cost. I think you knew that I was being treated differently than you were, and I think you chose not to ask too many questions about why that was happening because it was easier to assume there were good reasons for it. That's not the same as actively trying to hurt you. No, it's not, but it's also not the same as caring enough to make sure I wasn't being hurt. Another long silence. I should have asked more questions. Yes, you should have. I should have insisted you be included in the engagement party. Yes, you should have. I should have told them that I wanted you as my maid of honor, regardless of what anyone else thought about family dynamics. Yes, you should have. Can I still do that now? Can I fix this? I looked around my apartment, at the books and plants and carefully chosen furniture that represented the life I'd built independently of family approval or support. It was a good life, a meaningful life, but it had always felt incomplete without the kind of family connection I'd spent years trying to create. I don't know, Celeste. That depends on whether you actually want to fix it or whether you just want to manage the situation so that everyone feels better without anything fundamental changing. I want to fix it. I want you to be my maid of honor. I want you at every wedding event and family celebration. I want Harrison's family to know how important you are to me. Even if it makes Mom and Dad uncomfortable, even if it complicates your relationship with Harrison's parents, even if it means having difficult conversations about family dynamics instead of pretending everything is fine? Yes. Even then. For the first time in days, I felt something that might have been hope stirring in my chest. Then call Harrison and tell him that. Make sure he understands that this is what you actually want, not just what you're saying, because you feel guilty about what happened. I will. Tonight. And Celeste? Yeah, this isn't just about the wedding. This is about how our family operates going forward. If you want me to be part of your life in meaningful ways, that has to include regular family events, holiday celebrations, future milestones, all of it. I understand. Do you? Because this conversation with Mom and Dad made it clear that they see me as fundamentally different from you, fundamentally less deserving of consideration and celebration. If you agree with that assessment, if you think their approach has been reasonable, then we need to have a different conversation about what kind of relationship we can realistically maintain. I don't agree with their assessment. I think I got so used to being the one who was celebrated that I stopped noticing you were the one being overlooked. But I noticed. And I should have said something. After we hung up, I made myself dinner and ate it slowly, taking time to appreciate the quiet satisfaction of having finally said things that needed to be said. My phone buzzed periodically with messages from Nora asking how the day had gone, from William Vale checking in about the family conversation, from Harrison confirming plans for lunch later in the week. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was surrounded by people who were genuinely concerned about my well-being, rather than managing my role in their own lives. It was a strange sensation, both reassuring and slightly overwhelming, like learning to breathe different air. I didn't know what would happen with my parents, whether they would choose to examine their behavior or double down on their social strategy. I didn't know whether Celeste's promises would translate into actual changes in how our family operated, or whether the old patterns would reassert themselves once the immediate crisis passed. But I knew that I had finally stopped accepting treatment that felt wrong, had finally insisted on being valued instead of managed. And whatever happened next, that felt like progress worth making. 3 weeks passed before I heard from my parents again. 3 weeks of quiet mornings in my apartment, Of lunches with William and Patricia Vale, where they asked genuine questions about my work and listened to the answers. Of phone calls with Harrison, where he updated me on wedding planning decisions, and actually requested my input on things like music choices and ceremony readings. Celeste had kept her promise. She'd called the next morning after our conversation to officially ask me to be her maid of honor, not with the careful politeness of someone fulfilling an obligation, but with the excitement of someone sharing good news. She'd also called our mother to inform her that the wedding party had been finalized, and that any objections to those decisions could be addressed privately, rather than through manipulation of family narratives. The silence from my parents felt both ominous and peaceful. Part of me had expected immediate pushback, defensive phone calls explaining why I was being unfair or unreasonable. Instead, there had been nothing at all, which somehow felt more significant than any argument would have. I was in my office at the Historic Preservation Society, reviewing grant applications for a church restoration project, when my assistant knocked on my door. "Your mother is here to see you," she said, her expression carefully neutral in the way that suggested she'd picked up on undercurrents she didn't fully understand. I found my mother in the reception area, sitting perfectly upright in one of the antique chairs we'd restored for the office waiting room. She was wearing a navy dress I recognized from important occasions, the kind of outfit she selected when she needed to project authority and respectability. Her hands were folded in her lap, but I could see the slight tremor in her fingers that indicated she was more nervous than she was allowing her posture to convey. "Mom." "Hello, sweetheart. I hope I'm not interrupting important work." "It's fine. Do you want to come back to my office?" She nodded and followed me through the hallway, lined with photographs of historic Charleston buildings we'd helped preserve over the years. I'd never given her a tour of this space, had never shared much about the daily details of my work beyond general updates delivered at family dinners. Watching her take in the evidence of my professional life, the awards on the walls and project photos documenting successful restorations, I realized she'd never shown much curiosity about what I actually did here. My office was small but comfortable, with windows that looked out onto a courtyard garden and walls covered with architectural drawings and historical maps of Charleston. She sat in the chair across from my desk, glancing around with what appeared to be genuine interest. "This is lovely, Zara. I had no idea your office was so charming." "Thank you." We sat in silence for a moment, both of us apparently waiting for the other to establish the purpose and tone of this unexpected visit. "I came to apologize," she said finally. The words hung in the air between us, simple and direct in a way that was unusual for our family's communication style. I'd expected deflection, explanation, perhaps an attempt to find middle ground that would allow everyone to feel better without requiring actual change. "What are you apologizing for?" "For treating you like a problem to be managed instead of a daughter to be celebrated." I blinked, surprised by the directness of her acknowledgement. This wasn't the careful language she'd used during our previous conversation, where exclusion became consideration and marginalization became protection. "What changed your mind?" She looked down at her hands, and for the first time in years I saw her without the armor of perfect composure she typically wore to difficult conversations. "Patricia Vale called me." I felt my stomach drop. I'd grown to like Harrison's mother during our recent lunch meetings, had appreciated her warmth and genuine interest in getting to know me. But the idea of her calling my mother to discuss family dynamics felt like a potential disaster. What did she say? She said that she'd been looking forward to meeting Celeste's sister at the engagement party, and was disappointed to learn that you hadn't been invited. She said that in her family, they'd learned that excluding family members from important celebrations usually created more problems than it solved. My mother paused, seeming to gather herself before continuing. Then she asked me to explain why we'd felt it necessary to manage your involvement in family events, instead of simply including you like any other immediate family member. What did you tell her? I tried to explain our thinking, the social considerations we'd been weighing, the way we'd been trying to protect everyone from potential complications. And she listened very patiently, and then said something that's been haunting me for weeks. I waited, watching my mother struggle with whatever revelation was coming. She said that in her experience, families that spend a lot of energy managing one member's participation usually aren't protecting anyone from that person's behavior. They're protecting themselves from having to acknowledge their own. The words settled into my chest like stones dropping into deep water, creating ripples that touched memories and realizations I was still processing. She suggested that perhaps your father and I should consider what we'd been afraid would happen if we'd included you fully in family celebrations, and whether those fears said more about you or about us. What did you figure out? My mother was quiet for a long time, staring out my office window at the garden where late afternoon light was filtering through ancient oak trees. We figured out that we'd been afraid you'd ask questions we didn't want to answer, and express opinions we didn't want to hear. The honesty caught me off guard. I'd expected continued justification, more explanations about social dynamics and family management. I hadn't expected this kind of direct self-examination. What kind of questions? Questions about why your achievements never seemed as important as Celeste's. Questions about why your opinions were dismissed while hers were solicited. Questions about why we seemed more invested in your sister's happiness than in yours. Each admission felt like a small weight being lifted from my chest, recognition I'd been carrying for years without fully understanding what it was. And what kind of opinions? Opinions about our priorities, our choices, the way we'd structured our family relationships around what was comfortable for us, rather than what was fair for everyone. I leaned back in my desk chair, trying to process this conversation that felt completely different from any we'd ever had before. So you excluded me because you were afraid I'd point out that you were treating me unfairly? We excluded you because we knew you'd point out that we were treating you unfairly. And we weren't ready to acknowledge that or change it. The distinction was important, the difference between unconscious bias and deliberate avoidance of accountability. What made you ready to acknowledge it now? Realizing that we were about to lose you entirely. And realizing that we'd be losing you, not because you were difficult or demanding, but because we'd been failing you as parents for years. I felt tears starting to form, not the frustrated tears of being misunderstood, but something closer to grief for all the time that had been lost to fear and avoidance. Mom, I never wanted to be difficult. I just wanted to be included. I know that now. I think I knew it then too, but I was so focused on maintaining control of family dynamics that I convinced myself your inclusion was the variable that needed to be managed, rather than my own discomfort with being challenged. What about Dad? Is he ready to acknowledge this too? Your father is struggling with it more than I am. He's spent his whole life believing that families work best when everyone accepts their assigned roles without question. The idea that those roles might have been unfairly assigned is harder for him to process. What does that mean for going forward? It means that I can apologize for my behavior and commit to changing it, but I can't make promises about his behavior that he'll have to keep himself. The qualification felt both honest and disappointing. I'd hoped that understanding the problem would automatically lead to solving it, that acknowledgement of unfair treatment would naturally result in commitment to fair treatment going forward. What are you committing to change? I'm committing to including you in family decisions that affect you. I'm committing to celebrating your achievements with the same enthusiasm I show for Celeste's. I'm committing to asking what you actually want instead of assuming I know what's best for you. She paused, seeming to consider her words carefully. And I'm committing to defending your inclusion in family events rather than finding reasons to justify your exclusion. Even if it makes other people uncomfortable? Especially if it makes other people uncomfortable. Because I've learned that protecting other people's comfort at your expense isn't actually kindness to anyone involved. We sat quietly for a moment, both of us seemingly processing the significance of this shift in our relationship's foundation. There's something else I need to tell you, she said. About the wedding. My stomach clenched again, wondering if there were other manipulations I hadn't discovered yet. What about it? Patricia Vale asked me to help coordinate a bridal shower for Celeste. She said she wanted to make sure all the important women in Celeste's life were involved in planning it. Okay. She specifically mentioned that she hoped you'd be willing to co-host it with me, since you know Celeste's preferences so well and have such good relationships with her college friends. The invitation felt like a test of my mother's stated commitment to inclusion, an opportunity to demonstrate whether the changes she was promising would translate into actual behavior. What did you tell her? I told her that sounded wonderful, and that I'd check with you about your availability and preferences for how to structure the event. You didn't make excuses about why I might not be the right person to help plan it? Number. I told her I thought you'd bring exactly the kind of thoughtful attention to detail that would make the shower special for Celeste. The simple statement felt revolutionary, evidence that my mother could speak about me positively to other people without qualification or caveat. I'd like to help plan it. Good. Patricia said she'd call you directly to discuss ideas. My mother stood up, smoothing her skirt with the automatic gesture of someone preparing to return to public presentation mode. Zara, I know that apologizing doesn't undo years of unfair treatment. I know that promising to change doesn't immediately create trust that change will actually happen. No, it doesn't. But I'm hoping you'll give me the chance to demonstrate that I'm serious about treating you with the respect and consideration you deserve. I want to give you that chance, but I need you to understand that if the old patterns start reasserting themselves, if I start feeling managed and excluded again, I'm not going to keep accepting it quietly. I understand, and I want you to call me out if you see me slipping back into old habits. I want you to insist on being treated fairly, even if it makes me uncomfortable in the moment. After she left, I sat in my office for a long time, watching the light change in the courtyard garden as afternoon moved toward evening. Part of me felt hopeful about the possibility of building a healthier relationship with my mother. Another part felt cautious about trusting promises that hadn't been tested by real situations yet. I called Nora on my way home. "So," she said without preamble, "how did the surprise maternal apology tour go?" "Better than I expected, and more complicated than I hoped." "That sounds about right for family dysfunction recovery. Tell me everything." I filled her in on the conversation, the acknowledgement of unfair treatment, the promises about changed behavior, the uncertainty about my father's willingness to participate in family reformation. "It sounds like progress," Nora said when I finished. "Slow progress, but progress. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the part where they decide that changing their behavior is too difficult and they'd rather just convince me I was overreacting. Maybe that will happen. But maybe it won't. Maybe your mother actually meant what she said about defending your inclusion, even when it makes other people uncomfortable. How do I know which one it's going to be? You don't. You just pay attention to what actually happens rather than what gets promised. And you keep insisting on being treated with respect regardless of whether it's convenient for anyone else. The bridal shower planning became the first test of my mother's commitment to inclusion. Patricia Vale called me that evening to discuss ideas, and we spent an hour on the phone talking about Celeste's favorite things, her college friendships, the kind of celebration that would feel meaningful rather than obligatory. The next day, my mother called to coordinate our planning efforts, and for the first time in my adult life, she seemed genuinely interested in my opinions about family event planning. When I suggested we include some of Celeste's work friends who might not know the extended family well, she agreed immediately, instead of finding reasons why that might complicate the guest dynamics. When I proposed a more casual afternoon event instead of a formal luncheon, she asked thoughtful questions about my reasoning, rather than explaining why formal was more appropriate. Small changes, but ones that felt significant after years of having my input dismissed or redirected. The shower itself was beautiful. Held at Patricia Vale's home overlooking the harbor, it brought together women from different parts of Celeste's life in a way that felt natural and celebratory. I found myself actually enjoying the event planning conversations, feeling included in family coordination instead of managed as a peripheral participant. More importantly, I watched my mother interact with Patricia Vale and Harrison's sister, and saw her speaking about me with pride rather than qualification. When someone asked about my work at the Historic Preservation Society, she provided details I hadn't realized she knew. When someone complimented the shower decorations I'd helped design, she made sure I received full credit for the ideas. Celeste pulled me aside during the gift opening. "This feels different," she said quietly. "What feels different?" "The way Mom talks about you. The way she includes you in conversations. The way she seems actually proud of you, instead of just politely acknowledging your existence." It does feel different. I'm still waiting to see if it lasts when the immediate wedding focus is over. I think it will. I think she finally understands what she was doing and why it was wrong. What about Dad? Celeste's expression grew more complicated. Dad is still adjusting. He came to the last wedding planning meeting, and when Harrison's father asked about including you in the family photos, Dad didn't object. But he didn't exactly enthusiasm either. That's something, I guess. It's progress. Slow progress, but progress. The wedding itself became the ultimate test of whether the changes in our family dynamics would hold under pressure. In the weeks leading up to the ceremony, there were multiple opportunities for old patterns to reassert themselves. Moments where my parents could have reverted to managing my involvement, rather than simply including me. When the rehearsal dinner planning began, I expected to be consulted about my availability but not my preferences. Instead, both my parents asked for my input on restaurant choices and seating arrangements. When extended family members expressed surprise that I was the maid of honor instead of one of Celeste's college friends, my mother explained that I was the obvious choice as Celeste's sister, rather than making excuses about complex family dynamics. Most significantly, when my father's business partner made a comment about the wedding being expensive enough without having to accommodate every family member's preferences, my father responded that accommodating his daughter's preferences wasn't an expense but a priority. It wasn't a dramatic moment, not the kind of grand gesture that would make a good story. But hearing my father defend my inclusion as natural, rather than optional, felt more meaningful than any elaborate apology could have. The ceremony itself was perfect in the way that matters most, which is to say, it was perfect for Celeste and Harrison. I stood beside my sister as she married someone who understood the importance of treating family members with respect, someone who had been willing to challenge unfair dynamics rather than simply accommodating them. During the reception, I found myself at a table with Harrison's extended family, having conversations about my work and my life that felt genuinely interested rather than politely obligatory. At one point, Harrison's grandmother asked me about historic preservation projects I was working on, and I realized that this was what family gatherings were supposed to feel like, spaces where everyone's contributions and interests were valued. Later, as the evening was winding down, William Vale approached me at the bar. "How are you feeling about everything?" he asked. "Cautiously optimistic," I said. "It feels like things are actually changing, but I keep waiting for the test that proves whether the changes are real or just performance." "What kind of test?" "I don't know. Something that requires choosing between including me and maintaining social comfort. Something that proves whether they've actually shifted their priorities or just learned to manage the same priorities more carefully." William nodded thoughtfully. "In my experience, the real test comes when the crisis is over and everyone's attention moves on to other things. When being inclusive stops feeling urgent and starts feeling optional again. That's what I'm afraid of. But here's what I've learned from watching families work through these kinds of changes. The people who are genuinely committed to doing better keep doing better even when no one's paying attention. The people who are just managing a crisis revert to old patterns as soon as the pressure is off. How do I know which category my parents fall into? You pay attention to what happens at ordinary family gatherings 6 months from now, when there's no wedding to plan and no outside pressure to perform family unity. 6 months later, I got my answer. My birthday fell on a Tuesday, and I didn't expect any particular celebration beyond maybe dinner with Nora and a phone call from Celeste. Instead, my mother called on Monday to ask if I was free for dinner Tuesday night, and when I said yes, she said she'd made reservations for the whole family at my favorite restaurant. Not just my parents and Celeste, but Harrison too, and even Patricia Vale, who had become something like a surrogate aunt in the months since the wedding. When I arrived at the restaurant, there was a small pile of thoughtfully chosen gifts and a cake from the bakery I'd mentioned loving. During some long-ago conversation I'd assumed no one was really listening to. It wasn't elaborate, but it was genuine. My father asked about a preservation project I'd been working on, and listened to the details without redirecting the conversation to more general topics. My mother had invited people I actually wanted to spend time with rather than people who were socially appropriate. Celeste gave a toast that acknowledged specific things she appreciated about me, not just generic sister sentiments. Most importantly, no one seemed to be performing family harmony for an external audience. This felt like people who had learned to enjoy each other's company, who had figured out how to celebrate individual achievements without competition or comparison. As I was leaving that evening, my mother walked me to my car. "Thank you for giving us another chance," she said. "Thank you for taking it seriously. I know we still have work to do. I know that changing decades of family patterns doesn't happen overnight. No, it doesn't. But it feels like we're moving in the right direction." I hope so. Because I've realized that I spent so many years trying to manage family relationships that I forgot to actually enjoy them. What's different now? Now I'm paying attention to who you actually are instead of worrying about who I thought you should be. Standing in the restaurant parking lot, surrounded by the evening sounds of Charleston settling into night, I realized that this was what I'd been trying to create for years without knowing how to ask for it. Not dramatic declarations of love or elaborate gestures of inclusion, but simple, consistent evidence that I mattered enough to be seen clearly and celebrated genuinely. The evening breeze carried the scent of jasmine from someone's garden, mixing with the salt air from the harbor. My mother hugged me goodbye with the kind of embrace that felt like a promise rather than a performance, and for the first time in my adult life, I drove home from a family gathering, feeling energized rather than drained. Change had come slowly, imperfectly, with setbacks and uncertainties that would probably continue as we all learned new ways of relating to each other. But it had come nonetheless, and it had taught me something important about the difference between accepting less than I deserved and insisting on being treated with dignity. Sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is simply refuse to disappear quietly. Sometimes the bravest choice is deciding you matter enough to be included, celebrated, and respected, regardless of whether that inclusion is convenient for everyone else. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the people who love you will eventually learn that including you isn't a burden to be managed, but a gift to be treasured. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.